The journey to the fourth book in the series was not an easy one for Douglas. The third book had been a trying experience for him, and immediately afterwards he was not happy with it. At the time. Now this is hardly unusual. Douglas was usually his own greatest critic, and it was usually not until he was working on the next book that he looked back at the previous one and could see its greatness rather than being brought down by all the flaws that he was seeing. But in this case, there were also some people who felt that this wasn't as good as the previous two, and given the timing of that, it just reinforced his feeling that he'd made a huge mistake writing a third book and promised that there would not be a fourth. So what happened? Douglas's friend John Lloyd, the one who was supposed to co-write the first novel with Douglas as well as produce the TV version, he had his own success in the form of the previously mentioned Not the 9 O'Clock News. So that both men had a franchise that they were now tied to that was very popular and successful, but consequently a bit stifling. Well, one thing led to another, and they decided to work together on a book that they would call The Meaning of Liff, a book of made-up definitions using place names. For instance, Liff, a town in Scotland, is a book whose contents are belied by its cover jacket. The two went to Malibu, California and rented a beach house as they worked on the book, and it was out there that they met Michael Gross and Joe Medjuk, film producers. They got on well with Douglas and convinced him to have a go at making a Hitchhiker's film. Douglas had turned down a previous offer to make a film because they wanted Star Wars with jokes, as he called it. Unfortunately, Douglas didn't get along so well with their boss, Ivan Reitman, who would of course go on in the near future to make the enormously successful Ghostbusters. Both men clearly knew comedy and science fiction, but somehow they just couldn't mesh. Douglas grew more disenchanted with the process and with California, and eventually decided he had to return to England for the sake of his creative well-being and probable sanity. Meanwhile, Douglas's agent and publisher were pressuring him to make a fourth novel. Even if it wasn't as universally beloved as the first two, the third had still been a #1 bestseller, and after everything he had been through in California, Douglas wanted, more than anything, to just go home. So the same way his body returned to England, his mind returned to the world of Hitchhikers. So finally, he said yes. That he was offered a giant advance, adjusted for inflation over $2 million, was encouraging. But given the circumstances, it's no surprise that when Douglas thought about what was next for Arthur, it was for him, too, to finally go home. The story starts just like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy had, about the people of Earth, digital watches, and the girl in the shop. Unlike before, which ended with, "This is not her story," this time we're told, it is. Except, actually, it isn't. More on that at the end. The reason this is now possible, though, is because we soon find ourselves on a road in the middle of a storm where Arthur is deposited by a passing spaceship. His welcome back to Earth mostly consists of assholes drenching him, which is probably appropriate. Speaking of assholes, we also check in with Ford Prefect, on an alien planet attempting to pay a bill with an American Express card. A bit of a take that. I confess it's probably the only card that I have never held, for the reason that Douglas brings up here. Nobody takes the damn thing. Ford, however, has found a way to abuse the fact that the card isn't accepted anywhere. The power of the guide is such that people will gladly trade services for a good write-up. So, to protect what sliver of integrity the guide has, employees have to make a bona fide attempt to pay and be in danger before it is permitted for them to do such a thing. Ford's American Express card, thus, is a key for him to state he tried to pay, they just wouldn't accept his money. But what really shows Douglas' impressive foresight with the guide is what happens soon after he gets out of his enormous drinks bill, by waiting for the copy of the guide to update itself, which happens at regular intervals over the sub-Ethernet. In other words, the same thing that our regular software patches do all the time. This book was written the same year as Neuromancer, and the year that DNS was introduced, to show how remarkable Douglas's forward thinking was when he came up with this. Arthur has now chanced across the girl that is mentioned in the novel's introduction, Fenny, drugged into unconsciousness while her dipstick brother gives Arthur a lift. He explains what apparently happened during the Vogon events from the point of view of the rest of the human race. That everyone panicked, then all of the ships just vanished, and the whole event was written off as a CIA-induced hallucination plot. I say the rest of the human race because, of course, Arthur was exempt from the wholesale destruction that followed, and instead went on a whole bunch of crazy adventures, which Douglas later admitted was what made sending Arthur back home a mistake. Arthur was supposed to be an everyman, a typical human, but because of those experiences, Arthur no longer fits in with the rest of the human race. His experiences have made him perhaps the most unique living member of his species here. So it's no wonder that he is intrigued by Fenny, who is really his only contender, having flaked out in the midst of the event, passed out, gone into a hospital, and according to her brother, had once broken a bone that no one had ever heard of. But the line that I will forever love from this book, summing up Arthur's experience at coming home, is, "As stunned as a man might be who, having believed himself to be totally blind for 5 years, suddenly discovers that he had merely been wearing too large a hat." Arthur's transformation is most clearly seen after he returns home, cleans himself up, and now is able to sense the web of life all around him. Trees, sheep, people. When he falls asleep, he floats out of his house and awakens flying over his neighbor's rose bushes. Arthur is clearly a different man now, but has decided to try to return to a normal life, calling the BBC to tell him he's gone mad, so they cheerfully agree to continue his sabbatical. And for everyone else, he, drawing again from Douglas's own experiences, tells everyone he's been in Southern California. The primary focus of the book this time around is on Arthur Dent. For the first time, he is the one really driving the story rather than being carried along in it. And what Arthur wants is Fenny. Not in a sexual way, at the moment, I mean. Definitely later on he will. But he clearly possesses a strong attraction to her that is both physical and, for lack of a better word, spiritual. He can tell that she is as out of place in this world as he is. The story is about Arthur because this time the book is a love story. Earth is not just here as a place for Arthur to go home to, it's a place for him to find true love. The problem for Arthur is finding it, though, or specifically finding Fenny. She departed his life with him knowing only 2 things about her: her first name, and that she was being taken to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Arthur's attempts to track her down with both the systematic search and by sensing the web of life on Earth both fail, only for him to nearly run her down with his car when they finally meet again. After a bit of typical Arthur behavior, circumstances soon lead to him and Fenny, who reveals she's actually Fenchurch, to talk in a pub as she waits for her train. She's bemused at his frustrations with an old woman selling raffle tickets, enough to write her number on the back of one of the raffles for him. But of course, Arthur wins, forgets that the ticket has the number on the back of it, and has lost her forever again. Once again, Arthur tries to track her down. Once again, he fails. Depressed at the incredible stroke of good fortune to finally reunite him with Fenchurch, only to lose contact with her again, well, Arthur decides to buy a computer to find his cave on prehistoric Earth. A thinly veiled excuse for him to buy one that he can play with. Arthur, as you can tell, is becoming more and more like Douglas by now. And Douglas has that bit of love-hate thing with computers himself. On the one hand, he sees them as eddies and haxars because of his own experiences with them, the impersonal form of malevolence that they can represent, or deep form of frustration. At the same time, he's fascinated by them, and even worked on a Hitchhiker's video game and later more computer projects. So Arthur mucks about with it, uses complete nonsensical techniques to try to come up with an answer for where his cave was, and even knowing the whole thing is nonsense, still declares the answer correct and then travels to go visit his cave. And what does he find there? Fenchurch. It's her house. God bless computers. During their time together, Arthur shares a story of how he accidentally stole someone else's biscuits, something that happened to Douglas once, in fact, and then Fenchurch tells the tale of the question to the ultimate answer from her point of view, the events that led up to her realization, the moment it hit, and how she can no longer recall it. Trying too hard actually makes her pass out. Well, coincidentally, Arthur had dropped his copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy from his bag during the car ride, and Fenchurch had picked it up and eventually read it. Now, she didn't have a babelfish, but since Arthur didn't have one when he first read it either, it's likely that A, it has a babelfish-like ability to translate, or B, when Ford was adding to the guide, he included an English dictionary. In any case, she's fascinated by all the stuff that's out there and wonders if they can go there, which Arthur is horrified at, having finally escaped that 8-year nightmare. Fenchurch believes is the place to best find out what had happened that day, which is of course ironic because the answer had come from the earth itself. During the romantic evening, when Arthur is trying rather desperately to get into Fenchurch's pants, she insists that first Arthur must figure out what's wrong with her. Eventually he does. Her feet don't actually touch the ground. She's terrified that this is going to send him shrieking out into the night, but Arthur instead goes inside and, after a few false starts, manages to fly again, something that he'd given up back on cricket because the birds became such a damn nuisance. Seeing this spectacle, Fenchurch is obviously unsure what to make of everything, but follows Arthur's instructions and is soon out flying with him. It's at this point that Douglas takes a moment to break the fourth wall. From Douglas's perspective, he's cranking out the sequel to a novel that wasn't as popular in the first place, only now he has no idea where he's going with it, having it edited by someone who's in the next room, and it's primarily a love story. And during the entire process, Douglas has said that he felt like the whole world was looking over his shoulder while he was writing, telling him what he should be doing, which wasn't what he wanted to do. For this reason, Douglas now speaks directly to the audience, in a bit that sounds like every exasperated creator speaking about dealing with fandom, in which he goes into detail about why he doesn't, in fact, go into detail. At least when it comes to Arthur's daily life, and by extension, Arthur's sexual practices. He concludes with the remark that if you want to finally see all of that, read on. Otherwise, skip to the last chapter because it has Marvin in it. Neil Gaiman originally wrote that this was a, quote, patronizing and unfair, unquote, treatment of the reader. Douglas is not only going to do what he wants, but he is basically telling anyone who doesn't like it to piss off to the end of the book where the lowest common denominator material is. Gaiman has, however, changed his mind upon later reflection and sees it as Douglas's own fears being expressed, that he was a man who was no novelist, writing a novel, and with no time to go back and revise it. Douglas isn't telling people to skip ahead if that's what they want, so much as promising that if you're tired of this, he understands and promises there will be some Marvin to make up for his travesty of a story. What follows is the natural inclination of two people in love who don't need to give a damn about gravity, and that is boning in midair. Now, as established, Douglas was mostly making things up as he went along, and of course was doing things for comedic effect. But I still think this situation is all part of a deliberate bit of exploration of love. What, after all, is the thing that Douglas has emphasized about flying in the series? A point so important that he even has it come up as a form of daring do when Fenchurch makes a rookie flying mistake. It's, don't think about making it happen. Just let it happen. It'll come to you so long as you allow it. But if you try to make it happen, you'll screw it up. Now think about Arthur's attempts to hook up with Fenchurch. Every time he has tried to meet her, he fails. It is only when Arthur stops trying that he finally succeeds in finding her. So it's appropriate that this metaphor for the out-of-control relationship Arthur has with one's out-of-control feelings in such a situation are handled in a situation where the most important rule is, don't think about screwing it up or you'll screw it up. Just let it happen and it'll work itself out. After quite a bit of time spent having flying sex, they get down to the business of what's bothering Fenchurch, and they reason that it has something to do with the dolphins, since they all disappeared at the same time. Since, of course, they knew it was coming and tried to warn the humans about it before they themselves left. Since that's something that never occurred to experts, no one has the faintest idea what might have happened to the dolphins. But eventually Arthur tracks down the only possible person who can help, a man in California named Wonko the Sane. Generally, it's a bit difficult to accept the sanity of someone who feels the need to go to certain lengths to emphasize that they are, in fact, sane. Wonko feels the need to emphasize this because he himself is convinced that it's the world that's gone mad, a conclusion that he reached after reading the instructions on a pack of toothpicks. To further prove this point, his house is inside out, and thus when you go in, you are, to Wonko the Sane, exiting the asylum. He's also quite intent on proving that the angels that visit him to eat nachos and talk about their cocaine habits actually do exist by showing the off-the-rack sandals that the angels like to wear. All of this is probably a chance for Douglas to continue to riff on California, given how much he had grown to despise L.A. But still, you can also make the point that its insanity is in the eye of the beholder. But what lends at least some validity to Wonko the Sane's claims is that he produces a bowl, identical to the one that Arthur discovered upon his return, which Fenchurch had likewise received. But if one listens to it, they receive a message from the dolphins, the implications being that the earth was indeed destroyed, so the dolphins pulled another one from the whole general mishmash to serve in its place. But while that answers the situation with the dolphins, well, not completely, but it's as far as they're going to really be able to get, it doesn't solve Fenchurch's question about what happened to the message that was growing in the back of her mind before the end had come. Which, of course, is a reminder of the one thing that Douglas had in the back of his mind if he ever returned to Hitchhikers, which was the final message from God to his creation. So Arthur copies things down as best as he could remember from the guy who was always laughing at him. This book has no doubt gone a long way towards justifying why he was doing that. And they proceed to wait for an alien ship to show up. Said alien is, in fact, Ford Prefect. Ford had been appearing throughout the story since discovering the Earth was no longer destroyed, most of which is spent mucking with an alien ship and the British telephone system. As he explains, the cleverness of his scheme is to bankrupt the bad guys this way. And we also learn about the arriving UFO delivering a giant robot who says that it has come in peace, despite demolishing a great bit of London, and wanting to be taken to their lizard. There's, naturally, a bit of a brouhaha, but this is their ticket to outer space and eventually to the world where God's final message to his creation awaits. Naturally, the area around the flying saucer is blocked off by the military, the police, and the sheer number of people, but Ford tricks his way past them all by posing as a scientist, with Arthur and Fenchurch selected to haul his scientific equipment, old movies and beer. And they get on the ship right before it departs. Thanks to this, they are able to reach the planet, which appears to have turned into a tourist trap, with tickets, mementos, baked goods, and the like, all there to wring a few bucks out of the visiting pilgrims. Among them, shockingly, is the dying husk of Marvin, who thanks to time travel shenanigans is now far older than the universe itself, and has not gotten more cheerful with age. Despite his demeanor, they bring him the rest of the way and help him see the message. Now, what the message read off to Marvin is, and what Fenchurch agrees is what she felt come to her in that moment, don't seem to fit, seeing as how it was something that could make life work, which suggests that perhaps, like the Babelfish, it changes to fit the person who is reading it. It certainly fits Marvin, who, upon being told by the Creator that, "We apologize for the inconvenience," that he actually seems happy before the final end. So Long and Thanks for All the Fish is the book most unlike the others in the series. Its humor is low-key, its tangents few, the zaniness is practically non-existent for the first 38 out of 40 chapters. Adams takes time to tell anecdotes and poke fun at human things, but it's often a very different kind of humor than what is found throughout the rest of the series. For this reason, the book is often at or near the bottom of the list for fans. Speaking personally, it is not a book I can really take to task for any crime, other than not really being the kind of thing I come to Hitchhikers for. It is not in any way bad, it's just that it's Chinese food when you were hoping for Italian. Am I saying that it doesn't fit then? Sort of. It certainly distances itself the most from the others, probably by design, and concerns itself far more with the emotional concerns and personal issues of the protagonists than ever before. Or perhaps protagonist singular would be better to say, since, as I said, the book doesn't really seem to be about Fenchurch despite what the start of the book says. What we learn about Fenchurch is only what she reveals to Arthur. It's Arthur that we're really learning about. It's very much a story of Douglas working through things for himself on a typewriter, for good and for bad. Perhaps the biggest sign of all of this, then, is that the next book renders this one virtually meaningless, as Douglas quickly clears the decks and returns Arthur to being confused by the galaxy. Next time, it's mostly harmless.